go from there. So our first speaker today is going to be Patric Doyle, and he's going to be speaking to us about the transition of the Red Wings from the Cardinals to the Orioles era. So.
Thank you, Ryan. As opposed to Ryan, I'm someone who does not know most of you. As a native Rochesterian, I lived for 35 years in Kansas City before returning here, and haven't had an opportunity to be terribly involved in the local group, but I'm glad to be here to talk to you. This is the part of the program where the old guy gets to stand up in front of you and go down memory lane. A few of you may be my age, so hopefully most of the names will mean something to most of you, although I'm sure a few of them, particularly you younger ones, won't identify with too much, but we'll try to keep it rolling and make it enjoyable for everybody. My topic today is Cot, Clyde, and Luke, and as Ryan said, we're talking about the years when the Red Wings transitioned from their affiliation with the Cardinals, which lasted 33 years, and then moved on to the Orioles for another 40 years plus. It was a particularly interesting time to me because I had a perspective that most people did not have. In addition to sitting in the stands for a number of years, I was hired by Tom Decker, the voice of the Red Wings back in the 50s and early 60s, to be his statistician and broadcast assistant. That gave me the opportunity to not only see the Wings from the press box level, but also to have access to the clubhouse and the various other off-the-field parts of the ball game. So it was a particularly meaningful time in my life, and I feel very privileged to have spent what amounted to 4 years in a position that ordinarily I would not have had. So it was a very special time. The transition from the Cardinals to the Orioles, as most of us know, was a rather sudden event, at least in terms of its particular moment when it happened, but there were a number of years prior to it where there was a deteriorating situation with the Cardinals, and so the ultimate event was not that sudden. The most familiar names to most people for that era off the field would have been, of course, Maury Silver and George Sisler Jr., the general manager. During my time with the Red Wings, Maury had some physical declines and he was not terribly active, at least in the administrative aspect of the team. George Sisler was a rather distant individual who spent most of his time secluded in his office or the press box, and so he was not one that most of us knew, aside from whatever happened to be in the newspapers at the time. For those of us who went to the ballpark on a regular basis during those 3 years, it was Cot, Clyde, and Luke. Cot and Clyde, of course, being the two managers of the team, Cot Deal and Clyde King, and Luke Easter. Well, if you don't know about Luke Easter, you probably don't belong here. I think everybody has a pretty good idea who the big man was. And so I'm going to talk about the three of them, my observations of them, particularly in the clubhouse and kind of off the normal line of view. Cot Deal. For most of us in my age bracket, Cot would have been among the most popular Red Wing figures in the post-war era, at least until Luke and ultimately Joe Altobelli came along. Cot was an individual who had a long history in baseball, beginning in the majors with the Red Sox in the late 40s. He was traded by the Red Sox to the Cardinal organization in 1949, spending a couple of years with Columbus and the American Association, and then moved on to the Red Wings in late 51. He would remain with the Red Wings as a player and then coach and then manager throughout the decade of the 50s, with one exception. that being 1954, which he spent in the bullpen with the Cardinals. But Cott's presence was a very, very common one in Rochester. Most kids my age had multiple Cott Doyle autographs hanging around the dugout before the game, and you could always get Cott and Duke Markell and Tommy Burgess, guys who just were more than willing to share as much time with kids as they could. And so I had a number of Cott autographs. But my first formal meeting with him took place early in the 1959 season. Tom Decker took me down to the clubhouse after a game, introduced me, and Cott was an immediately gracious man. Affable, warm, friendly. I don't think, again, that would be too much of a surprise to anybody who goes back to those days. After a brief conversation, Cott invited me to join the Wings on the field for batting practice every day. His son pitched batting practice to the pitchers at that time, and Cott invited me to join him. Well, what kid isn't going to do that? I was 15 years old at the time, and my daily schedule now included a 3 o'clock arrival at the ballpark, put on a uniform, go out in the field, and join the gang out there. My relationship with Randy was a close one, a good man, still alive, living in the Oklahoma City area. But he, along with his father, left the Wings in early August of '59 when Cott resigned as manager. Randy, moving on, automatically elevated me to the role of pitching batting practice to the pitchers and the subs. And then after I was done with that and the regular batting practice took place, then I go into the outfield and shag flies and demonstrated my lack of talent on a baseball field. But that wouldn't stop me at that age. Cott and I remained close friends for the rest of his life, which ended in 2013. Multiple visits, phone conversations, emails, whatever. And by the way, at this point, I mentioned that on the table for your observation, we've got some baseball cards of players from that era, a couple autographed pictures, a couple autographed balls, which are barely legible now after 60 years. I do have an autographed picture of Luke Easter, and at the end of my talk, I will have a very, very brief trivia question, and one individual in here will get to take home an autographed picture of the big man, if you would like. So Cott and I remain close, just an extraordinarily good man. And Cott's goodness, if you will, pervaded the clubhouse. His players loved him. He began every day entering the clubhouse and circling the room, stopping at every player's locker space, talking about the family, their health, the team, whatever. Took the better part of an hour before Cott eventually wound up going into the manager's office and beginning to get ready for the game. His respect among the players grew even more early in the '59 season when we were playing Montreal one Friday night, and one of the Red Wing hitters was hit in the back by a pitched ball, which was interpreted as being deliberate, and Cott charged the mound and became entangled with the pitcher, who happened to be 4 inches taller and 30 pounds heavier than Cott, but that didn't stop him. The next day we talked about it, and he said it was the dumbest thing he did in his entire life. But that was Cott, and he was willing to protect his players and to do whatever it took to be supportive of them. Cott followed closely the example of his mentor, Joe McCarthy, who managed the Red Sox in the late 40s. And Cott took on many of Joe's attributes as a manager: close to his players, innovative, highly aware of the complexities of baseball, and able to translate that to the field. One of the things that Cott did, and as far as I know it's unique among managers, it was his method of sending signals to the players, either from the dugout or the third base coach's box. Like most managers, he'd go through the physical rituals, And concluding them, then he'd give a shrill whistle of encouragement. Back then, whistling on the field was more common than it is now. What most people didn't realize is the signal was in the whistle and not in the sign. And so every play had its own particular whistle code. And when the Wings were on defense, every player in the field had his own code, and Cott would whistle to them with positioning or whatever. I'm not aware of any other manager in baseball who used that system of conveying signals to the players. Cott's years as manager happened to take place as the relationship between the Red Wings and the Cardinals was deteriorating. Things that we see as everyday events in baseball now, almost the daily rating of a minor league roster and a player going up to the major league team, dictates by major league management what minor league player was going to be playing in that day's lineup. Things that we accept today were not the rule back then, but the Cardinals, under the Bush regime, which became more businesslike than previous ownerships, enforced that, and it made Cott's managing style a little bit more inhibited. On top of that, we didn't have a terribly good team in '59. There were some off-the-field issues, and it all came to a boiling point in late July when the team took a road trip down south, went to Miami, and in Miami several players broke curfew, and Cott, for one of the few times in his life, imposed fines on the violators. A couple days later, they went to Miami, to Havana, and there the events that Ryan described in his talk last year, the shooting of Frank Verdi and one other player on Havana, pretty much ended the season for Cott. Emotionally, it took a great toll on him. A week later, we were back here, Saturday night after the game was over, which we lost. Players left the clubhouse, and Cott announced to the writers that he had resigned. So Cott's era with the Red Wings ended on August 1st of 1959. Next morning, I went to the clubhouse, just having read about it in the paper, and I couldn't get in the clubhouse. I think the only time in my 4 years that the clubhouse door was locked to anybody other than players. Cott was giving his goodbyes to the team. So I went upstairs to the radio booth, and in the first inning, Cott came up and sat down with Tom Decker and me and talked about what was going on. I went next door to the press box, and while he was visiting with George Sisler, a call came from Cincinnati. The baseball grapevine back then was far faster than the internet is today. Everybody knew everything before the public did. And Clyde King had expressed his interest in becoming Red Wing manager. Clyde had a difficult relationship with Fred Hutchinson, the Reds manager, and wanted out. So the job was open, and a little bit of conversation between Gabe Paul, the Cincinnati GM, and George Sisler, and Clyde became the Red Wing manager. As soon as Clyde became Red Wing manager, Gabe Paul then said to Cott, "Would you like to be Cincinnati pitching coach, taking Clyde's place?" Cott accepted, and so one at the same time, Clyde was on his way to Rochester, Cott was on his way to the West Coast to meet the Reds team out there, and we had an immediate transition from one to the other. So Clyde becomes Rochester manager. He and Cott were very, very similar as far as their human qualities. Both deeply religious, strong family values, highly intelligent. They were both pitchers as ball players, and they were both baseball lifers. They spent their life in the game. As managers, they were very different. Cott, as I said, was close to his players. Clyde was not. When Clyde's day began in the clubhouse, he'd enter the door, bolt to the manager's room, to the office, looking neither to the right nor the left, closing the door, and that's as close as he got to his players. He went out to the field for batting practice, but it was a very, very different type relationship. Just as Cod had his mentor in Joe McCarthy, Clyde's mentor was Branch Rickey. And they shared many, many similarities. So it's not really surprising. Clyde signed with the Dodgers during the war when Branch was the owner of the Dodgers, or the president of the team. And they remained close through their lifetimes. Not only were they amiable, but they had a certain similarity of interest. We know about Branch Rickey and ending segregation, and we know about Rickey beginning the farm system in baseball. But one other aspect of Rickey that was very, very obvious was his interest in numbers. Statistics were extremely important to him in formulating his roster and devising his lineups as a manager and then moving up the ladder. Clyde shared Rickey's interest in statistics. And that was the basis of my relationship with Clyde. We were not personally as close as I was with Cod, but we were professionally closer. One of my jobs was to every day figure out what we today call the splits. That is the right-handed versus the left-handed performance. And so I gave Clyde a supply of index cards every day with the opposing team and what every player on the Red Wings did against the other team. And that I did for 4 years, and that was the basis of my relationship with Clyde, and I'm grateful that I had it. And so Clyde continued to be the Red Wing manager until the end of the 1962 season. And then he was replaced by Darrell Johnson, who would terminate my relationship with the team as far as statistician. I lost my clubhouse access, and nobody blames him for that. He didn't know me, I didn't know him. But there's another figure we haven't talked at all about, and the one that means the most to all of you, and that's Luke. Luke Easter is, from my perspective, one of the finest individuals that I've had the privilege to know. We know about his on-the-field performance and the things he did even as an old man on the field. But to me, what was more vital about Luke was who he was off the field. And if you're an admirer of Luke, nothing I can say would disappoint you, because he was as high quality an individual off the field as he was on. And I think to most of us that's no surprise. Luke's day began obviously before batting practice, an hour or so prior to it. He'd come into the clubhouse around 3 o'clock, always elegantly dressed. On Sundays, he had a suit, dress shirt, and tie. During the week, he would downgrade to a sport coat. But Luke had I can't say a formality to him, but a dignity that he carried with him. He'd walk into the clubhouse, and the players would stop what they're doing, and everybody would greet the big man, almost like you saw in the TV show Cheers when Norm would come into the bar. Only there was far more respect for Luke than there was for Norm. So Luke would go to his dressing space, which is about as center as you could get in the clubhouse, near the manager's office, near the training room, near the door, near everybody. He'd go to his space, first thing he'd do is grab a pile of mail that had been put up there for him. He'd quickly rifle through it, maybe open something that looked important, but everything else went back up and went home with him after the game. No clubhouse attendants ever signed anything for Luke Easter. He did it all himself. So the mail would go back, and now he would begin the long process of undressing and putting on his uniform. And the reason it took so long was because Luke was never alone. The first stage of office hours for Luke would be, as he's beginning his process, players would start coming up to him one by one, always individually, kind of like Vito Corleone in The Godfather, on his daughter's wedding day. Everybody went up to Luke, talked about whatever it is they talked about. Luke always got privacy from everybody else, so there was no danger of somebody listening in to what the conversation was about. It may have been about getting sausages, because Luke owned his own sausage company, and maybe he was just selling sausage. But I think it was probably a lot more serious than that, because I never saw too many smiles. Never saw any signs of animosity or anything like that, but it was serious conversation. Once that stage of office hours was completed, then Luke would sit down. He was the only player in the team who had 2 stools in front of his dressing cubicle. And at this point, he'd start inviting individuals, always one-on-one, and he'd ask a certain player to come sit down, and they'd talk. A pleasant conversation, but there was also an element of seriousness to it. And that would go on for a half hour or so. 2 or 3 times each season, I would be the fortunate guest. Most days I'd walk past his locker, and he'd say, "How you doing, Bub?" He called everybody Bub. I don't think he ever used a first name in his life. "How you doing, Bub?" And I'd say, "Doing good, Luke. Keep on going." But on these special occasions, I'd say, "Doing good, Luke," and he'd say, "No, how you doing? What's going on?" That's the invitation. So I go over and sit down, maybe 10, 15 minutes or so. And as I look back after all these years, I wish that I had done a better job of directing the conversation. "Luke, do you remember so-and-so? Or what was it like to play for so-and-so?" "Well, I was too young," and so, besides this, I think how Luke wanted it. He directed the conversation. It was always about me. "What's going on in school? What are you studying? How are they treating you up there?" Meaning the press box, the radio booth. We talk about the team, his opinions on a few things. He always talked to me as an adult. I'm 15 years old, but I was an adult from the perspective of our conversation. He was one of the few players who never used profanity with me. Always respectful of people. So our conversation would go on, and finally it would end. And he'd always end up by saying, "Do you need anything?" I said, "No." He'd say, "Well, if you do, you come to Luke." Well, I never did, but I know that if I had, he would have addressed whatever my need was. So that part of office hours ended. Now Luke finished dressing, got his cap and his glove, and went down the tunnel into the field, got on the field, threw a few balls to loosen up, and then office hours, third station, takes place behind the batting cage on the first base side. And now Luke's audience would grow. Writers, scouts, opposing players, presuming that there wasn't an umpire up in the stands, checking for fraternization rule violations and a $25 fine. Back then they enforced it, today obviously not. But Luke's audience widened. But in the '61 season, it narrowed down a little bit because he had a constant companion. And that companion was Boog Powell. Luke was Boog's mentor. And where Luke went, the 19-year-old Boog went. It was a magnificent relationship, and we could probably discuss their relationship over the course of another talk. But it was serious, but it was also convivial. Boog was one of the few guys who could kibitz Luke, who could razz him a little bit. You never saw Luke razzed much by his teammates. There was too much respect. But Boog could get a little jive in there. 19 years old, but they got along so well. Luke, like all great hitters, always had a bat in his hand. And you watch the two of them side by side, and Luke might be pointing at something out in the field or leaning on the bat or whatever, but they were side by side. And then came fun time. After hitting was over, they'd go down to first base, and they would try to prove to each other that they were the greatest fielder in baseball history. Well, neither was a great fielder, but they made sure that they hot dogged it enough to give the other the impression that they were really superb with the glove. One thing that I might mention, I failed to talk about Clyde, and that is a book that was written at that time called The Long Season by Jim Brosnan, kind of the first tell-all baseball book. Brosnan was a pitcher on the Cardinals and the Reds in '59, and obviously both Clyde and Clyde were pitching coach with the Reds, and Brosnan had a lot of quotes from both of them. Nothing that the kids couldn't read, but there was some incisive remarks about baseball. Ironically, Cott was the Yankee pitching coach in '65 when Jim Belton was collecting material for Ball 4. I think that Belton must not have thought that Cott was worth paying much attention to, because Cott didn't get mentioned in the book. I mean, it's fine by Cott, because he had little regard for Belton and less for the book. But anyway, Luke, back to winding up his day, after batting practice, all the players would go back into the clubhouse. One exception, Luke would sit down in the dugout, and now it's station 4 of his office. More visitors, more company, more laughter. That's just the man that Luke was, day in and day out. And he was so highly thought of by his teammates, by opponents, by everybody in baseball. It was just a marvelous thing to see. My time with the Red Wings ended, as I said, in '62. Tom Decker resigned as announcer and went on to become a TV anchor on WVET and then WROC. And Joe Cullinan came in to be the announcer. Joe always worked alone, which is fine. He had his own style. He didn't need a statistician, didn't need a broadcast assistant. And so I wrapped up my days with the Wings. I'm very, very fortunate that I knew the people I did. I kept contact with some of them over the years. Luke and I exchanged letters occasionally until we finally lost track of each other. And of course, then he died. I'm still in contact with a few of them. Ron Cavas, who was shortstop back then, and Randy Deal. Most of the others are long gone now, so those opportunities are gone. But they were a marvelous 4 years, and I'm so grateful that I had them. I guess I'll finish in an editorial comment, and that would be that I think that there is something wrong with the fact that this magnificent baseball talent and baseball mind, Luke Easter, never had a chance to manage. There are many reasons for it. Obviously, he had a reputation of being difficult to manage as a young player, which he lost over the years. African Americans were just beginning to manage then. Gene Baker was the first African American manager in Batavia in '61. So maybe the time wasn't right, but I would have a difficult time knowing Luke as a man, knowing his knowledge of the game, his ability to communicate with players, fans, media, whoever. I think it would have been a wonderful thing if he had that chance. So I'll open it to any questions you might have, but first, let's have a real brief trivia thing, and this is going to be simple. I'm going to start front row and just go side to side. First person to answer the question wins the picture. Well, what's the question? What was Luke Easter's given first name? Let's start with you. Nothing. Nothing, sir. Lacrosse. Luscious. Luscious. Luscious, he said it's the only mistake his mother ever made, calling him luscious. But, okay, well, we have a winner. So, I know we're having a time for the next speaker. Any questions that anybody might have? Yes, sir.
You mentioned you were 30 years in Kansas City?
Yeah.
Or some number of years.
Right.
Your stories about Luke Easter made me think about Buck O'Neill, and I was wondering if you ever had any contact with him and any, maybe I should.
I did, certainly not to the extent of Luke. Played golf in a couple of tournaments with Buck I don't know his relationship with Luke, but I think they would have been close because they were so similar,
Yeah,
so similar.
seemed like it.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, thank you very much. Yes, Kurt?
Yeah, is it true, I think so, but maybe you can confirm, that he holds the unofficial, perhaps official record for hitting the long home run in at least 3 minor and major league ballparks? Red Wing Stadium, War Memorial Stadium, and Municipal Stadium in Cleveland, correct?
That's correct, and you can add a fourth, San Diego.
Really?
Yeah, he was with the Padres very briefly before he came to Ottawa in the International League. But yeah, 4 ballparks, longest in each park. Okay, thank you so much.